Well, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Smilov. I am professor at the University of Sofia. I also work for a think tank in Bulgaria called Center for Liberal Strategies. And it's my enormous pleasure to be the moderator of a panel from the Putney 2023 debates, a very valuable initiative of the Oxford Global Society, of which I'm also a fellow. I have participated in a couple of these debates, which pay a tribute to the incredible debates from the 17th century that took place in Putney. And I think these debates provide a great opportunity to discuss the problems of current contemporary liberal democracy. Today, our focus will be on the representative structure, elections and political parties of representative democracy. And all our distinguished panelists will express views on the problems they see in this representative structure. And as panelists, we have a group of really interesting thinkers. I start with Professor Nicole Stremlau. She's a fellow and also a director of a program at the Oxford Center for Socio-Legal Studies. She's teaching. She's based in Johannesburg, and she has led numerous projects on political representation, and especially the link with the media. And she's going to speak about the importance of the internet and new media in contemporary politics, and especially in electoral context. We have with us also Dr. Fernando Casal Bertoa from the University of Nottingham. He's one of the primary experts, academic experts on political parties. He's written numerous books and articles on this topic, very influential ones. I myself have cited him numerous times, but of course, much more important people have cited him than myself. Fernando actually is a student of the late Peter Mayer. He did his doctorate with Peter Mayer at the University Institute in Florence, and he could give us a very valuable perspective on some general trends and processes in political parties and generally the representative structures of liberal democracy. And with us we have Professor Jurij Toplak from Slovenia. He's provost of the University of Maribor. He's also a distinguished scholar of political parties. And I should mention here that we are co-editors with him of a very important book on the funding of political parties in Eastern Europe, which was done a long time ago in 2007. And I should say that these were much more optimistic times for liberal democracy. And we thought that with a few changes here and there, a few reforms in terms of transparency, greater representation, and so on, trust in political parties will be restored forever. Now both of us probably are a little bit more skeptical about this issue, but we'll have time to explore that. And last but not least, I would like to mention a participant who couldn't join us, but was planned to do so. My good friend Marcin Walewski, who is now based in Kiev, and he's doing incredibly valuable job for the National Institute of Democracy and Ukraine. And due to heavy bombardment and a flu, he is not going to be able to join us, but he would have given a very valuable insight to various processes of erosion of democracy in parts of the world as Eastern Europe. Together with Fernando, Casal, Bertoa, and Marcin, we are part of expert group at the OSCE on political parties, and we saw firsthand actually the erosion of democratic values in and political pluralism in places like Russia, where actually democracy collapsed in a rather traditional Weimarian, we can say, way. And not surprisingly, now we have this terrible and old-fashioned war in Europe, very much in the manner of political confrontation of the 1930s. But today we are not going to discuss this type of more traditional collapse of liberal democracy into authoritarianism, totalitarianism, or something else. Our focus will be more on democracies that are far from collapse. So no matter what problems we are going to discuss, so none of these democracies, I hope, are not directly facing the prospect of collapsing into a dictatorship or a totalitarian type of government. Still, even for such democracies, even for democracies that are termed established democracies, this notion of a crisis of liberal democracy has been used quite a lot. Various concepts have been introduced that were discussed in the previous days, like backsliding, deconsolidation of democracy, and so on and so forth. And today we're going to see how these processes look from the point of view of political parties and the representative structures of liberal democracy. So I spoke quite a lot for an opening statement already, but I just want to mention two substantive problems that I find myself important of what is going on in party competition and in democratic politics regarding political parties and elections. And the two problems that I want to mention are first the excessive focus on the responsiveness of political parties and the sidelining of the other important element, responsibility. I'm using here Peter Mayer's famous opposition between responsiveness and responsibility. And it strikes me that a lot of contemporary political parties, especially those that are defined in one way or another as populist, they stress too much, excessively, the responsiveness to what the people want. They claim that they're going to represent the people and their preferences, their intentions, their beliefs, no matter what these are, without the standard filters, without the standard educational tools towards the voter, and so on and so forth. And indeed, we have a lot of political players crowding our democracies, whose main appeal to the voters is that they will represent whatever the preferences of the people are. These preferences could be homophobic, they could be xenophobic, they could be unappealing in other ways, but these populist political players, they promise to represent them in one way or another, no matter what. Why I find this problematic? Why this excessive stress on responsiveness might create problems for liberal democracy? First, because political parties, they lose their educational role. After the Second World War, for instance, the German public was re-educated partly by the political parties through their political foundations and so on, which took an active part in instilling democratic values in a populace which was affected by fascism and Nazism quite a lot. So today's political parties have lost this educational capacity due to this populist turn towards responsiveness. Secondly, parties which are excessively responsive and not so much responsible, they make coalitions more difficult because actually they speak to their co-voters, their beliefs and so on, and they are not willing to compromise. And as I speak now, I'm coming from Bulgaria. I'm based in Bulgaria, in Sofia actually, and we have had 5 parliamentary elections in the last 2 years. There might be a 6th one, without political parties being able to agree to form a government. And partly this responsiveness of the political parties explains why they are not willing to compromise in any way. And finally, when parties express the views of the people, they actually lose their leadership capacity and their capacity as authorities to lead the people in difficult situations towards an outcome which might not be straightforward, but it's a necessary outcome. And here I'll give an example with anti-vaxxers. If parties are very responsive, they might become responsive to anti-vaxxer attitudes, which in the last period actually created problems for many countries. And again, I'll give an example with Bulgaria, which had a record in excessive deaths due to responsiveness of political players to anti-vax attitudes. And so these might be directions in which liberal democracy starts to feel problems due to the problem of excessive responsiveness that I mentioned. And the second problem, which is related to this excessive responsiveness, is the problem of radicalization. Because not only political parties claim that they're going to represent whatever the attitudes, whatever the preferences of the people are, but in fact they need to escalate their claims just to prove that they're this super efficient tool of representation. What I mean is the following. If at one election you have argued that you're going to represent a difficult issue. For instance, let's say you say to the voters, I know that you are xenophobic, but it's all right. I'm going to take on board this issue and I'm going to become the speaker of this xenophobia in public life. Well, in 4 years, this might no longer be attractive. So no longer this no longer news. So the political parties, they have to pick another topic, which just to prove that they're efficient and they represent whatever people want. And you have this escalation of ever more absurd claims that are being represented. And actually, now we have parties that support claims that global affairs are run by reptiles and so on and so forth. And there are serious people who, in QAnon movements and so on, if they are not representing such claims directly, they at least try not to alienate such voters. So we have this radicalization of messages, which is partly unstoppable. And just to make the point a little bit more understandable, if you look at successful populist parties in Central Europe or Eastern Europe, the region that I know best, you'll notice that parties that have radicalized their message, they have managed to stay longer than others. Viktor Orban, for instance, he started as a liberal, became a nationalist, and now he's a champion of liberal democracy, whatever this means. So we have an escalation of more radical and more radical claims, and this is part of the success of such players. And if this logic is correct and true, radicalization endangers liberal democracy into in two ways at least, but I'll just mention one and I'll stop. And this is, it leads to polarization. So we have increasingly polarized societies. We have claims that are excessively and increasingly more radical. Well, some of the parties that are threatening liberal democracy in one way or another, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, they had a much milder agenda. So they wanted to reopen certain issues that were not readily discussed in public and so on and so forth. Now, such parties, they have much more radical agenda. Many of them campaign for dismantling European Union and other structures, supranational structures that they see as champions of liberal values or problematic in one way or another. So this radicalization, I think, is an important element. And in fact, my worry is that this is radicalization that is not driven by specific socio-economic problems, but actually it might be an inbuilt radicalization of the democratic process that we have. So in fact, the way of competition, the way of political parties that we create, it produces such radicalization regardless of the socioeconomic background. So I know that these are all claims that are difficult to substantiate in detail in 10 minutes empirically, but our task here is to throw in ideas for discussion, and I'll stop here. I'll give the floor now to Fernando Casal Bertoa for his opening statements, and we'll proceed with Nicole and Jurij afterwards. So please, Fernando.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this prestigious venue. I would like to share my screen just to share with you some thoughts that I have been working lately, and also, ending with some, I wouldn't say polemic, but, let's say controversial ideas of how, things could go forward in this world of, crisis of democracy, right? So I hope you see, my presentation. So I have been, working on this topic of the crisis of political parties for quite some time, and how, this has consequence for the way, democracy is working, and how, polarization has risen. I know that Jurij is going to talk later on a bit on polarization, so I will try to go fast on that side. So, well, this is not new, right? Political parties are in crisis. We know, even in the West European democracies, political parties are in crisis. We have here data for when United Kingdom was still member of the European Union. As you can see here, the average level in trust of political parties is around 17%. Which is quite low, but the problem is not that trust in parties is low. Is that trust in parties is the lowest among state institutions. Moreover, it's not about parties. Other representative and accountable institutions like parliament or central government are trusted even less than non-accountable, or at least not vertically, or representative institutions like the police or the army. Parties are perceived as corrupt. You have here data from Transparency International that the last time that they ran this question about which of the institutions are perceived to be more corrupt, and parties came as the most corrupt institutions over, professors, police, army, doctors, judges, in 51 out of 107 countries that were studied. But if you see the countries where, it is really interesting, Australia, United Kingdom, Finland, Norway, Canada, United States. So in very consolidated democracies, France, Germany, of course. So clearly, as Peter Mayer used to say, there is a void, right? There is a mutual withdrawal of parties and voters from the electoral arena, and this gives the opportunity to new parties to rise. Unfortunately, the type of new parties that tend to rise lately, especially after the Great Recession, are populist and anti-establishment parties, and this has led to an increase in the levels of polarization in Europe. In fact, this comes from the book that I published with Scholten Jedi, Patterns of Party Politics in Europe since 1848. You see here that the percentage of vote for anti-establishment parties has never been higher, not even in the interwar period was as high as now. We have basically 1/5 of the electorate that continuously, on average, votes for this type of parties, and this is a trend that we can see in every single region. We see the trend, in Eastern Europe. We see it, in Western consolidated democracies, but of course, especially we see it in Southern Europe, that it was one of the regions that was most hit by the crisis, right? So this is clearly a trend that we see everywhere. I don't have the time to present country data, but we could say that with very few exceptions, we can say that this trend is visible in every single European country. And what is the thing? One would say that, some people say that populism is an opportunity, right? However, the literature mostly says that, has important consequences for the quality of democracy. And this is something that you can see clearly here. The increases in the percentage of votes for anti-establishment parties has reduced, the quality of liberal democracy, independently if we look at Eastern Europe or at Western Europe. And also, using BDEM data, also we see here, the impact of polarization and votes for anti-establishment parties in every single dimension of democracy, not just liberal democracy, but electoral, participatory, egalitarian, and deliberative. So clearly we can say, some would say that populism is a cancer for democracy, populism, decreases the quality of democracy and may lead to, like in Hungary, a collapse of the democratic regime, right? But the question that I'm interested is why? Why is this the case? What is that leads people to vote for anti-establishment party? What gives to the rise of anti-establishment parties? Because only then we can really understand, what is the real problem and how the solutions can be proposed, which is how I will try to end my presentation today. So in a article that I published in the East European Political Science Journal, I found out that contrary to what many have said, it was not economic development that had led to the rise of both for anti-establishment parties, but the crisis of parties and social change. Using different proxies, we see here that the crisis of parties and the rising, the instability of voters leads to high support for anti-establishment parties. And this is something that the 2008 crisis has not triggered, but helped to impose, let's say. So we can see here that there was already a crisis of parties before, the Great Recession, but after the Great Recession, this crisis has, exponentially increased. So in a way, in the study that I published there, I see that it is social change, but also the crisis of traditional political parties. And because I cannot, change society or influence the social changes, but I can change. I can try to influence the way political parties behave. I will focus a bit more on this issue. So the main argument of what I have been presenting is that, in my view, populism is not an illness, it's not the sickness of democracy, but it is just a symptom of a more important, illness, which is the illness of political parties. And it is there that we need to intervene. In a way, we could say that it is the crisis of political parties that has led to the crisis of democracy, the rise of populism and polarization. And, in this sense, I would like to compare myself to a surgeon, right? So if we have a cancer, which is traditional political parties and representative democracy, we can think of different remedies. I'm going to pass very quickly because I only have 15 minutes through the first three, right? So when you have a cancer, what you do, well, you can do surgery and extirpate the tumors. So you could ban, populist parties. You could, of course, apply chemotherapy. So basically, a kind of cordon sanitaire. So you discriminate, all those parties. Or you apply a kind of hormone therapy and you accommodate these populist parties, right? So basically accepting either ideologically or bring them into government. In an article that I published in the Journal of Democracy at the beginning of 2021, I showed that none of these strategies has worked. There are some that, for example, banning parties worked for Germany after the Second World War. It centered the party system and allowed for the consolidation of democracy and party system stability. But, for example, it hasn't worked for countries like Turkey. Turkey is one of the countries that has banned more parties in Europe. We know it well at the core group of political party experts because we have dealt with the Turkish case quite a lot. In terms of the cordon sanitaire, it may have, work, for example, in Czechoslovakia in the interwar period, right? The Penka, we know it's a region that we know well, managed to consolidate democracy in Czechoslovakia with discrimination, let's say, of the communists and the Nazis on the left and the right. But of course, cordon sanitaire hasn't worked in France with the national front, right? In terms of accommodation, we can see bringing government populists into government does not necessarily work. In some cases, yes, they have been, a stint, although I don't know if it was worse the remedy than the illness. Let's think of Poland. The two populist parties that we have in 2005 disappeared, but now we have that the center-right party has become, more populist than the populists, right? So in reality, we can see that, these solutions do not have or do not constitute a certain remedy. So what I do propose, well, a stem cell therapy, or what I call the diet of political parties. So the regeneration of traditional political parties. Some of the things that I'm going to say might seem obvious, but unfortunately we know that, they are not applied in the countries that we have studied. So, sometimes I have the feeling that politicians tend to do the contrary of what I recommend when I go, to all these countries to have impact work. So the first thing I think that is important, and I think that, political parties have forgotten, is that, institutionalization matters. Party institutionalization, it is important for, combating, populism and polarization. The establishment on strong organizations. You have, excellent books by Nicole, Margit Davids, who have, shown how institutionalization matters, for the survival of political parties and the consolidation of democracy. Unfortunately, new parties, and I have a clear case in my country, in Spain, two of them most probably disappear, in December in the next elections. They think that, with just 150 characters, you can win an election, which I guess Jurij knows well in Slovenia. Yes, you can win an election, but this does not mean that you can be re-elected in the next elections. In Slovenia, you almost have, one new party winning elections every election. So clearly, a lack of organization, has led to the problems that we see in many, many countries. So this is one thing that is important. Unfortunately, politicians are not for investing in organization, but for using political parties as vessels for their particular interests. I think that, Daniel was talking about the two issues that I'm going to talk about, responsiveness and, responsibility. I think that parties should be responsiveness, but within certain limits. Of course, responsiveness means, for example, fulfilling their, reasonable programs, and also be responsible in the sense of not falling into a kind of politics of outbidding. This is what we see nowadays. Even traditional parties fall for it. If the populist party, promises, I don't know, that, we will stop all immigrants from coming from the country, the traditional party comes in and say, and we will expropriate their property. You have seen it, in Denmark and other even consolidated democracies where, the traditional political parties fall for it. Also, it's important that, political parties, are responsible in the way, they behave. I think that, the lack of, the rise of populism is based on a lack of trust, and, only by becoming responsible, political parties can really recover their trust. Topic, of course, I have worked a lot with Daniel, but also, with Marcin Baleski, is transparency. And one of the hobby horses of populism is that, political parties, traditional political parties, are corrupt. I think that, it is essential that, political parties become transparent in their communication, but also in their finance. In my articles, I have found, a clear, relationship between, high transparency of finance and, high levels of party institutionalization, high levels of transparency and low levels of polarization. So I think this is, very important. Also, I think that, and this comes back again to what Daniel was saying, I think that it's important that political parties recover their educative function and also lead by example. And in this context, for example, I can always put the example of politicians during the pandemic. We were all, locked down in our houses, and they were having, like in the United Kingdom, lovers meeting, in different households. Of course, people cannot understand this type of attitudes. I think that, one of the problems that we see today is that politicians and parties only think in the next tweet, in the next, poll, in the next, a survey. I think that there is a problem with lacking long-term perspectives. Also, I think that compromise, it is important. One of the problems I see is that, there is no stability in any type of policies nowadays. In my country, every time that the government comes, they change the law on education, the law on pensions, the law on immigration. I understand that there needs to be competition, and re-ideologization of the political spectrum is something that is important. But there are certain policies where, traditional political parties should come together and find compromises in order to avoid, polarization and politicization of issues that populist parties can use. And finally, I think that a conceptualization of democracy as a non-zero-sum game is very important. I have seen that a lot of traditional parties, falling for the trap of the discourse of populist parties as democracy is a zero-sum game, and trying even to, change legislation in order to avoid, alternation in government. So just to use a metaphor to conclude my speech, there are 5 stages of grief, right? So you can start with denial. Oh, no, populist parties don't exist. We ban them. It's okay. We see that it doesn't work. You can be very angry and you don't want any treats with them. I don't want, any kind of relationship. So you discriminate them. Cordon sanitaires do not work. You can accommodate them, bargain with them. Also, we see that no. And now we are in a stage of depression, right? I think that, this is where we are now. And what we need is to accept. We accept that, populist parties exist, that there are people that vote for populist parties, but that there are ways to combat them. There is a way to show that traditional political parties are better, that, institutionalizing traditional political parties helps for, the consolidation of democracies. I think that only then, we can really do something that will help, to improve democracy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Fernando. We move immediately to Professor Nicole Stremlau. Well, Nicole, please, you have the floor for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to take us in a very, very different direction. And I'm in Johannesburg now, so I'll be speaking about some of my research in Africa. So I'll be talking about internet shutdowns as resistance and how we can use it as a way of rethinking oppositional practices, particularly during election times. So as some of you might know, there's been this sort of steady increase in the use of internet shutdowns as a response to content online that governments find concerning. And this is particularly the case around elections, and particularly in Africa. You also see it in India and other parts of Asia. This is a growing phenomenon. And by shutdowns, I mean the sort of partial or the complete closing of the internet, also known as the internet kill switch. And it's often used by governments as a way of attempting to address disinformation around elections or attempting to mitigate the sort of perceived impact hate speech may have on offline election-related violence in the aftermath of elections. It's usually done in the name of national security. Shutdowns are almost uniformly broadly condemned by those that do not use them. So they're usually discussed as a legal issue in terms of violating the rights to freedom of expression or access to information. So you have a lot of international civil society groups that support freedom of expression. They focus on language like digital rights, the freedom to connect. Western governments have also long been advocates of supporting media freedom. In the US and the EU recently came out with the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which is very ambitious, as the title might suggest. And in 2.5 pages, the term human rights was mentioned no less than 25 times or 20 times. So overarching this human rights approach, or the internet freedom agenda, is this seemingly impenetrable binary, a struggle between democracies and autocracies, or is commonly being referred to now, this rise of digital authoritarianism. And so I want to be a bit provocative today and sort of challenge this sort of dominant narrative that's coming up, because I think this human rights narrative of shutdowns is also blurring why shutdowns are actually occurring. So once again, it's framing African countries as these figures of lack, of falling short of international election standards, democracy, these norms that are that are expected. And it doesn't create the space to really ask the right kinds of questions or uncover the alternative ways of identifying the rules, the regularities, and the logics around why shutdowns might be used. So I've been doing some research around internet shutdowns in Africa, specifically around government decision-making processes. So basically asking, why are governments choosing this relatively blunt tool of censorship as opposed to other forms of information controls? What is the process of implementing shutdowns? What is the rule of law, if at all? And I think one reason we see this rise of shutdowns is because of the recent trends in social media companies like Meta to have end-to-end encryption, so surveillance is more challenging. And certainly there are many cases of shutdowns being used by governments to assert power over opposition parties or deflect attentions from protests around elections. But I think there's also another story going on. So our research has mostly focused on Ethiopia and Uganda, but it's involved dozens of interviews in other countries where there have been shutdowns. And I want to speak specifically about the case of Uganda today. So recently, in the days, there were elections in 2021, and in the days immediately before the elections, Facebook took down a number of government accounts and pages that it argued engaged in coordinated inauthentic behavior to target political debate ahead of an election. And these accounts included President Museveni's press secretary, as well as a number of accounts linked to the Citizen Center at the Ministry of Information. And I think from the perspective of the National Resistance Movement, the ruling party, they were simply following the political tactics that they've been seeing elsewhere, other countries using. And they also said that they were following the same political tactics as the National Unity Platform, which was led by Bobi Wine. And he's the opposition leader, and he was aggressively using social media to campaign. The government had previously complained that the opposition was misusing social media. In a letter to social media companies, he requested the takedown of certain content, but no action was taken. And I'll return to this point. So for 5 days during the election, there was an internet shutdown. And finally, when the internet was restored, Facebook remained banned for more than 6 months after the election. And President Museveni argued, and here I will quote him, so if it's Facebook operating in Uganda, it should be used equitably by everyone who wants to use it. If you want to take sides against the NRM, then that group will not operate in Uganda, that group referring to Facebook. Uganda is ours. It's not anybody's. There's no way anybody can come here and play around with our country and decide who is good and who is bad. I'm therefore very sorry about the inconvenience to those who've been using this channel, but we cannot tolerate the arrogance of anybody coming here to decide who's good and who's bad. So basically the belief that Facebook was making these kinds of decisions autonomously. And I think Museveni here raises two key issues. First, who's writing the rules around what's allowed on social media, particularly around elections, and particularly around hate speech and disinformation. Secondly, how these rules are actually being implemented. And then third, I think what shutdowns show us as a response to this. What do they tell us about freedom of expression, law, governance in the post-colonial state, particularly around election time? So right now, when it comes to large Western platforms like Meta, like Twitter, the discussion around rules and content moderation is dominated by lawyers and technologists in the global North. And I think while there's some discussion of context around online speech or how the rules apply, it's usually from a cultural norms perspective about how to interpret certain speech. And I think for decades, socio-legal scholars have been looking at issues of hate speech and argued how laws are notoriously bad at accounting for context, understanding the ambiguous factors of identity, motives, history. But regulation has very much focused on the style and the superficial content of speech. And I think this has remained the case for social media. So what internet shutdowns are actually exposing is this massive and crude response by the state, is the broader theater in which these speech rules are playing out. And I think what is missing from this is a discussion or accounting for the context of the post-colonial state in the various ways that governance or law actually works, as well as the history of media and communications prior to social media, particularly around elections that have been part of so many state and nation building projects. And of course, this idea of sovereignty that Museveni spoke about. So at independence, where states were asked to replicate, African countries were asked to replicate the idea of the sovereign nation, a state with a monopoly on authority and justice, this ideal that took the Westphalian state 800 years to get rid of other sources of authority. And I think since independence, many of Africa's leaders, from Nyerere to Nkrumah, had very definite ideas around what role the media should play in this project. They've tried to leverage print, radio, television as tools for state and nation building, forcing a type of authority that could not be achieved during long and bloody struggles that other countries had. And control of the media combines some authentic projects, some very genuine projects of community building, but also with self-serving tactics to benefit the few and retain power. And social media platforms, combining their tremendous popularity and the still powerful imageries of tools for activism and contestation, and they're relatively inaccessible to national authorities. They broke this mechanism of control. So they came in and they just broke it because they're operating from California or Beijing. And I think we need to see shutdowns within this context, as well as within this sort of broader understanding of the contemporary realities of the state in Africa, rather than an idealized notion. So on the first point, when it comes to who write the rules, digital technologies, digital cultures, and the rules that accompany them, they're not these free-floating global spheres or communities. They're rooted in national power centers in the US, in China, in Tencent, Meta, Google. The kinds of community standards that they're termed, they're mostly drafted in California. So I think these rules or standards, they're not translated into African language. At the moment, it's just a handful of them. Algorithms are not trained in African languages, and the systems that feed fact checkers mis and disinformation that is trending have little or no capacity in African languages. And I think this comes at a time when the elevation, the integration of African languages is a really strong priority of decolonization for many institutions and governments, including, for example, where I am at the University of Johannesburg. And so despite this discourse by social media companies of a focus on communities, we see an overwhelming emphasis on the state and how they relate to the state. Again, we see it in language when it comes to content moderation. They focus on the language of the state. In Ethiopia, it's Amharic, which is actually spoken by a minority of people, but it's the language of the government. While there's little moderation in other languages that aren't the language of the government, including historically marginalized groups. And on this issue of who writes the rules, I think the challenge is how to account for the role of ideology in terms of how communication's been seen, regulated, and what kind of role it has in post-liberation nation-building projects. So Uganda, like many countries, has a long history of debating and defining what kind of speech should be allowed. The NRM had a very ambitious media apparatus that was integral to its struggle. And after coming to power, the media was liberalized, and the government even started independent newspapers, the New Vision, that was sort of seen as this unique experiment that was supposed to be critical of the NRM as part of what it turned to be single-party democracy. But the rules that the government tried to come up with were not ahistorical, and they were very much also negotiated with courts, opposition actors, and other public authorities. But these kinds of discussions or processes of negotiation haven't taken place with the rules and the rulers that govern social media. So for a poorer country like Uganda, which is not Germany or the EU, and has little power to negotiate and influence these rules, they're just thrust on them, and they're just expected to adapt to them. There's no particular contextualization for their particular political projects. And I think we also see how unevenly and unequally these rules are being implemented on a global scale. And I think this was one of the major findings from the Frances Haugen Facebook leaks that happened, where social media companies were very clear that they have priority countries, priority markets when it comes to content moderation, and they do very little in Africa. Companies are slow to take down content around elections and marginal markets, and they've also been accused of ignoring genocide in places like Ethiopia and Myanmar. I think there's been far less research at a national level in terms of like the consistency and the even-handedness which these rules might be implemented, particularly when it comes to political parties, opposition parties, and government parties. And I think Uganda again, points to some of these challenges. So, for example, with the Facebook case, there was very much this question of whether the opposition was treated the same as the government when it came to the takedown of inauthentic behavior. And here I think the evidence suggests no, that Facebook took down the government inauthentic behavior, but did little to address the opposition, of which there was also evidence of inauthentic behavior. And particularly for the government, this appeared uneven. It raised questions about the process, and they argued that Facebook had favored the opposition by allowing them to create numerous accounts and post online, but it had blocked the government's efforts to do the same. So I think one of the challenges here is that the only way that the government saw that it could fight back effectively was to shut down the internet. And the challenge, and this connects to this challenge of like whose rules for taking down content have to be followed. So prior to the elections, for example, the Ugandan Communications Commission wrote a letter to YouTube requesting the takedown of certain videos, arguing that they were inciting violence, compromising national security. And Google declined the government's request, and they said there was not a court order. And Nicholas Appiah, a human rights lawyer, argued that it was one of the problems was the way that the government approached Google. It reflected a gap in understanding or a gap of great ignorance as to how large social media companies actually operate, how content is assessed according to a company's community standards. And so basically he was arguing that they just Google would just throw the letter from the Ugandan government in the trash. It had no relevance. They couldn't take it seriously. But it also shows, in a way, I think the government was also left humiliated because these companies don't have offices in Uganda. There's no one that you can go knock on the door necessarily and have a conversation about it. Decisions are often made hastily. They're often made with little evidence. They're often made with very, very, very little staffing as well. So in conclusion, I would just like to be clear that I'm not trying to justify internet shutdowns. I'm not trying to say that they're a good or useful tool necessarily, but rather I think we need to change how we think about them and also recognize them as forms of contestation, as forms of resistance, particularly in the global South, rather than just dismissing them and just categorizing them as abuses by despotic leaders around elections. We need to understand more why they're happening. And I think social media is creating the sense of moral panic for some governments. They seem out of reach. The companies seem out of reach. They can come in to countries and completely mess up with the politics of a place without knowing the rules or ideologies or even having effective processes in place for moderating content in local languages. So I think if we start to see shutdowns as a form of contestation, it might start to open up new ways of engaging with them, new avenues of how to respond to them, rather than just dismissing them.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole. Really very interesting issues, especially when you compare this topic with the issue of blocking certain content like Donald Trump or Twitter, which is a different approach, but raising the same set of questions about the standards and so on. And I think Professor Jurij Toplak is going to say something about issues that relate to the topic that you brought up. So Jurij, please, you have your time for opening statements, which might indeed be closing statements as well, because I understand that we have to finish a little bit earlier. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel, and I'm grateful to the Oxford Global Society and especially to Daniel Smilov for the opportunity to be part of this remarkable event. I will talk about elections and democracy in crisis, but at the same time, because debate by definition involves opposing views, opposing arguments, doubts, questioning, I will try to contribute by bringing a different perspective on some topics that have been debated over the last 3 days. First, I will kind of oppose the usual arguments for the view that democracy is in decline. Then I will explain where I see true threats for democracy in polarization and in global suppression of free exchange of ideas, and then possible solutions. So, is democracy globally in crisis, or narrower, is electoral democracy in crisis, or at least in distress? Arguments usually include American electoral problems, Trump, Bolsonaro, Hungary, Poland. Elections are being questioned, challenged, and losers do not recognize results. And opposition crowds recently in a few countries broke into parliaments following elections. But historically, there are, looking at the data, more countries holding elections than ever, more peaceful transfers of power than ever. Opposition crowds have been breaking into parliaments following elections for decades, even centuries. And when these occurrences have been happening globally frequently, and now that they happened in US and Brazil, in my opinion, that does not prove that there's a global democratic decline. There are true reasons are somewhere else. So a historical overview of annulled elections also does not support the claim that electoral democracy is worsening. The number of revolutions, violent overthrowing of governments, losing parties not leaving power is not growing. True, there's a growing number of elections being challenged in courts, but that's good. It's a great achievement of our societies that those who are dissatisfied with elections can turn to courts rather than violent protests. The court's involvement hugely benefits democracy. It can remove voters' doubts, remedy violations, increase trust, and when needed, invalidate flawed elections and defend the integrity of the electoral process. To accept election results, voters often need to see that the candidates and the authorities have followed the law. So Austria, Switzerland, Slovenia, Iceland, Kenya, Malawi are just some of the countries where courts have recently invalidated national elections or referendums. It is essential, however, that politicians and opinion leaders ask voters to remain calm and let the courts do their job. After year 2000, Bush versus Gore, the idea that courts, not protests, are the right remedy in disputed elections went all around the world. International organizations have fought hard worldwide to reform legal systems and convince societies that courts are the right remedy. And it is puzzling to see in the last 2 years that many changed their view. Many political scientists, scholars, observers, commentators changed their view. And now they are stressing the stance that doubting elections undermines democracy. I mentioned the argument Hungary-Poland. It is popular to say that Hungary and Poland prove a global democratic decline, but by what objective measure? To me, an objective measure seems European Court of Human Rights. Each year, it considers over 60,000 alleged violations of human rights and fundamental democratic principles from 46 countries. And looking over a decade, over 500,000 alleged violations, Hungary and Poland do not stand out. Not by number of violations and not by trends, like worsening the human rights situation or democratic standard situation in these two countries. The European Court of Human Rights, according to the statistical data, very different. Some other countries are the examples of worsening democracy. I would suggest against academics following media titles, but rather using data and research. Then American electoral problems are often arguments in favor of the view that there's a global democratic decline. Campaign finance transparency, mail-in voting, foreign influence, long lines, gerrymandering. But when we view at these issues in countries that we see as, or the countries where there's the really high trust in elections, like Northern Europe, we see that the mail voting is even more suppressed than in the US. Campaign finance is less transparent than in the US. foreign influence in other countries, there's much more foreign influence than in the US. Americans and foreign billionaires, they influence elections in other countries much more than they do in the United States. And not talking about the influence through the democracy, diplomacy and embassies. So second part, where I see a true threat, I see it in growing polarization. Daniel mentioned radicalization of messages, and Fernando showed a lot of evidence on growing polarization. And secondly, global suppression of free exchange of ideas. The free exchange of opposing views has been used as a cornerstone of democracy and the bedrock upon which open societies flourish, enable progress, and hold governments accountable to their citizens. Over the past decade or even less, however, through the privatization of channels where we communicate and through legal limiting of speech, free exchange of ideas is under serious threat. In the US, not so much by law, but through privatization of communications, those who control communication are now setting the rules. In Europe, legally, permitted free speech has shrinked. The top European court, for example, I checked how often it used the phrase that there's a right to offend, shock, and disturb. And 2 decades ago, the court stressed this right, but now this phrase is disappearing. So possible solutions to reduce polarization, I see one of the possible solutions in electoral systems. And there are electoral systems that limit polarization. One of them is the board account. This is one of the ranking methods, but unfortunately not one that is often proposed in the last few years in the United States. The board account is a system that has been around for a few centuries in French Academy of Sciences, for example, in many sports organizations in the US and around the world, but not so much in politics. Why I mentioned the board account as a measure against polarization? Because this is mathematically known as the method that fosters consensus building by rewarding candidates who are preferred by a broad range of voters rather than just those to whom these candidates are the first choice. So this is the system that helps those towards the center. And when we speak about declining democracy around the world, we all seem to be going on a wagon where US actors set the agenda, lead the debate. American political scientists, media, they decide which topics will be on the front. But when we look at countries that are supposedly better, they are not much better. We don't meet, or very rarely we meet, Scandinavian scholars who would be critical of their own countries. But when we objectively look at campaign finance, electoral system, procedures, electoral disputes, campaign rules, we do not see that US is such a bad, has so bad elections or electoral processes compared to these other countries. So I would suggest that we commentators should also look at ourselves, that because we often contribute to the polarization by forming our own bubbles rather than being open to those with opposing views. And increasingly our written scholarly works are less and less using objectivity and data for conclusions. So I try to be within the 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jurij. We do have some minutes for discussion, and well, I would like to encourage you to ask questions to each other. I have three very brief questions to one to each of you, and you might choose to answer it or not, or you might make a comment or address a topic that you find interesting from some of the other speakers. But anyhow, I'll put my three questions to you, and then I open the floor. And we'll start with Nicole this time, and Fernando and Jurij. So my question to Fernando is about this idea of strengthening mainstream parties. And my question is what to do in political settings where the whole idea of mainstream parties has gradually disappeared. And I'm not going to give an example with Bulgaria, where it's difficult to say which is a mainstream party, but think, for instance, for Poland, we should try to revive social democratic parties or the Hungarian context. So, which are the mainstream parties that need to be strengthened? Or if we think of Greece, for example, should we try to rehabilitate PASOK in some way? So that's my question. Sometimes the very idea of a mainstream party has been eroded so much that it's very difficult to imagine how they should be resuscitated. For Nicole's discussion, really it's fascinating. Because in Bulgaria, Facebook is a big political tool, and we have all these debates, who is doing the moderation. Even the local company that was doing the local moderation on behalf of Facebook was recently changed because a lot of complaints about its work. But I would like to ask you, for a possible solution, because you raised attention to the problem, but didn't quite hint in which direction the solution should go. Should, for instance, moderation be localized totally? Should it be under government control? Or something else? Simply in more practical terms, what would be the implication of the serious problem that you raised? And finally, with Jurij, I think that I agree that that polarization also applies to commentators and researchers as well. But also I see that in some of the research, like this book, How Democracies Die, Ziblatt and Levitsky, they make this argument, Fernando also made it, that there is a point beyond which democracy starts to fall apart. So, okay, free speech is great, differences in opinion are great, but if you think that you should press your advantage against your opponent at all costs, even at the cost of invalidating elections, doubting the validity of elections, which are pretty normal, and so on and so forth, the fabric of democracy might start to fall apart. So what is your view about these issues? And so these are my thoughts. And I give the floor now to Nicole, either to answer my question or probably to relate to topics which she finds interesting in what the others said.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think one of the great things about doing empirical work as well is that we get to do the research and we don't always have to propose the solutions, but we try and understand the challenges that are being faced. So I think this issue of inequality of content moderation, because that's really what it is. I mean, the content online is being moderated very differently in the global north than it is the global south. I don't think there's an easy solution to that, obviously. I think one of the challenges as well is that a country like Germany has an embassy in Silicon Valley. They have an army of lawyers, and they themselves are constantly moderating content to find hateful content that violates their laws, and then they can charge, Facebook $20 million if they don't take it down within 24 hours. A country like Uganda, no one is going to listen to the Ugandans. And I'm sorry, but it's true. That's the reality. Uganda doesn't have the kind of infrastructure at the national level to put that kind of pressure on these powerful social media companies. I mean, the GDP or the worth of Facebook must be, guessing off the top of my head, 500 times more than the entire GDP of the Central African Republic. So it's a huge inequality between these countries and between the companies. That being said, I think content moderation itself is shifting rapidly with AI. I don't think AI is going to hold solutions in the short term for this issue of moderation of African languages in particular. I think one area where it's there needs to be a much more unified front, for instance, the African Union needs to speak on behalf of its countries and have a more unified voice and policy and approach to this to try and get some kind of response from these large, wealthy companies. Because I think at an individual national level, we're not going to be able to really see dramatic changes taking place.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, now we go to Fernando.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Daniel. To be honest, it's very pertinent. So, and this is something that I have been thinking about, and I don't know if I have a final question, right? But what I certainly see is it's important to understand one thing, right? As you know, I'm very much promoter of institutionalization, but I think that institutionalization is a bit like the Goldilocks story, right? Too little institutionalization is bad. Nobody doubts that. I think, I have lots of publications where I show this, but too much institutionalization may not also be a good thing, and you see, for example, the cases of Hungary, the cases of Georgia, when you have, these dominant, parties, right? In our book, we have a chapter where we showed that, under let's say, poor economic conditions, institutionalization might reduce the quality of democracy, right? So I think it is important to take that into consideration, right? So I think that this supporting of mainstream parties is not a panacea. I wouldn't say, of course, bring back PASOK. I mean, now I'm working on a project trying to improve, party aid programs, party assistance. And I still think that it is important that we focus on, mainstream parties and those that are in favor of democracy, because they are the ones that, if they are in the right side, of the cleavage, let's put it this way, they are going to save democracy. And if they are in the dark side of the force, let's use this metaphor, they are easier to be attracted to the right side than those that are not. So I still think that, we should look for, whatever mainstream parties we have. This doesn't mean, of course, that we have to bring PASOK or we have to bring, but, we have to avoid that mainstream parties go to the dark side. For example, I'm talking about my country. We have the Socialist Party. As you may know, there was a late opinion of Odir on judicial reform in Spain that criticized them because they were attracted to the ideologies that the populist, junior colleague in government were imposing. And we are talking about one of the oldest political parties in Europe. So even the Republican Party, with Trump, we have to at least avoid that the mainstream parties go to the dark side, and this is what I always try to support. But a great question and a lot to think about it.
Jurij, it's your turn, please.
Thanks for a question about how democracies die. As I see it, democracies in individual countries will die when they have no control over their communication and exchange of ideas. Nicole's examples on how we are getting 4 or 5 platforms, small groups of people who frame global communication, and when we open our computers, they decide what we see. They can decide which candidate of the 2 that are in elections in a given small country will get positive news on the top, and which one will be portrayed negatively, or it will not even be mentioned. And to more than 180 countries in the world, these who decide are foreigners. I think when in these 180 countries, when there's somebody abroad framing communication, this is, I think, when this democracy is dead. It is somebody outside framing communications, decisively influencing elections. And to your question about challenging election results, when Al Gore challenged Bush's win, this was seen as how it should be done, through the courts. When in the last few years, this whole idea that the courts are the right way of challenging elections has changed. I still believe that this is the best way of doing it. Not just that when Al Gore challenged elections, most commentators praised there. For many years, there were books published how Bush was illegitimately elected, right? So this is not new, what is happening now. What is new is that the mainstream view is that it's not that good anymore to challenge elections in courts, right? But I don't see any better alternative. The courts, when they decide, just like they did in the case of the last American elections, the courts ruled that Republicans' challenges had no basis, and I think it is really excellent for democracies to see that, to see the judgments, and to know that under law, elections were properly run. So I don't see any better alternative to the courts being involved. And even if there's no basis, going to the court, even if there's no basis, I think it's beneficial for democracy that if there's a dispute, the losing party goes to the court confirms, and everybody sees who is legally and a true winner. I don't see anything bad in letting the courts have the last say. Of course, the courts may be biased, but that's a different issue.
Okay, I'm with you on this issue about the courts. Unfortunately, our hosts tell me that we have to stop our discussion now. I think we were getting into very interesting waters, but hopefully we'll have other opportunities to continue it. And I'm often reminded in such discussions of an observation which a famous Hungarian economist, János Kornai, once made at a conference. He said about the problems of different countries, the fact that we're in the same hospital doesn't mean that we suffer from the same illness. But but from our discussion, I think that there are common themes that are emerging and that are worth pursuing in the future. So thank you very much for your effort and your excellent contributions. I just want to tell our audience that they have to tune in again at 5 o'clock for the concluding lecture of these 2023 Putney debates, which is going to be delivered by the Honorable Malcolm Turnbull, who is former Prime Minister of Australia. So thank you once again, and enjoy the lecture of Mr. Turnbull. Thank you very much.